Hello and welcome to God and the Family, a series where I, Gershly Karen Pierre, speak about biblical concepts and tie that into our population, our families, our communities, and of course, our God, so that we can help make better sense of our place in this world and what I perceive would be God's ideal society for us. Today's scripture is Psalm 68, verse 6. This is the King James Version, which states, God setteth the solitary in families. He bringeth out those which are bound with chains. But the rebellious dwell in a dry place. The New International Version words it as, God sets the lonely in families. He leads out the prisoners with singing, but the rebellious live in a sun-scorched land. The scripture seems fairly obvious, and I'm thankful that the onus of responsibility in fulfilling it is God, Him setting the lonely in families. But in order to appease the scripture, one would actually have to admit they were lonely. And if someone is lonely, then maybe that's not the easiest process to acknowledge. Because we live in a world, if you're, quote, soft, that's a bad thing. Meanwhile, the scriptures say that God would soften people's hearts and replace the stony heart with one of flesh. This world wants people to pretty much be as cold and angry as demons, as opposed to empathetic and soft and tender as we are biblically commanded to be. And as such, you would have to admit, you don't have to publicly admit it. That's why the scriptures tells us to go into our private place and seek God. You can lie and say that you're not lonely, but He would know because He searches the intentions of your heart. And the scriptures say that God gives grace and strength to the humble, but the proud He opposes. So if you're proud and arrogant and you're like, no, I'm not lonely, and then you use a different wording, you're not going to be given the aspects you need that would fulfill the things that you deeply want. Never mind the fact that He would call your bluff because He searches your hearts and even knows the intentions behind the words that you're saying. There's a lot of naysayers in our collective who say they don't like the opposite sex, but why would you talk about that person every day? They have this obsession where they have to constantly speak on what the opposite sex is doing, the gender war scenario. And in them bashing the opposite sex, they probably wouldn't want to admit that they desire the opposite sex. But the scripture speaks about how there are some people who were born without any desires for romance or lust or anyone at all. And whether they were born that way or they became socialized that way, Paul talks about them. Paul was one of them. And you don't have to marry anybody. You could actually be content within yourself. But the people who are like that, those people genuinely wouldn't apply to this scripture, nor would they have the passion to talk about the opposite sex in a negative way. So negative rage against someone is still a form of passion. And so whether it's a passion that's obsessive or a passion that's hatred, you're not proving the point that you're not lonely if you constantly have to bring up someone else. Deal with the hurt and the trauma, in fact, in prayer. Because God can see your loneliness, but if you're aggressive and angry and proud about it, He'll oppose you. That's why it says in the scripture, the rebellious will be given a scorched, dry place. Because in the scriptures, that's where demons are sent, into dry places. That's where demons go because they're rebellious. Do you want to be in a place like a habitation of devils? In a dry place with devils? Or do you want to soften your heart and be set with families? Why be around people that are likened unto devils, laden with devils, and all they do is bash the opposite sex? Like a devil. When you can be in a family group with happy, smiling babies, a joyful, tender spouse, an affectionate family group, a love that is drenched with so much bliss. And that's what I believe God would want people to possess. The family that is endearing, and not just you, millions and billions of others. It should be the far majority in my viewpoint. And there are enough scriptures to conclude that God would be pro-marriage. So we already know it's His will for people to become married. And we already know He said it's not good for a person to be alone. But if we know that and we want to come into agreement with Him on that and pray for the thing we desire, be honest. And I wish the world would be more honest as opposed to languishing and bashing and all the other odd things that they're doing. But the gospel is foolishness to them that are perishing. They're perishing within their own hell in earth circumstances. Let's bring heaven and earth by praying according to God's will. And if He said He'll set the lonely in families, praying according to His will is petitioning Him for that thing, which is the family, and knowing that He will give you that thing because He's pro-marriage. And He wants to bless people with families. And maybe you can make a prayer list and say, Lord, this is what I want my future family to look like. This is how many times a day you want to sit at the dinner table talking with your children and your spouse. This is how many family traditions you have and all the heartwarming and soft things that families come with. This is how many joys that you want to fulfill. But it's your home, and in the privacy of your home, whatever that family is that you desire, I recommend, like God says, if any of you has anything, ask Him for it. Oh, Lord, you set the lonely in families? Well, I want a family. I want to be in whatever role it is you are within your nuclear family. If you're the wife, if you're the husband, if you're the mother, if you're the father. Because when you create those children with your spouse, it will be a blessing unto those children. It will be a blessing unto the communities. So let God set the lonely in families. And let's create a world where there's more joy and excitement and love and bliss and heaven in earth than there is torment, sorrow, suffering, bashing, bullying, trauma, and chaos. So that is all I have for today's episode of God and the Family. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for more.